October 1941. The cold wind is already blowing across the vast Russian plains, carrying with it the distant smell of smoke and destruction. In Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, the map of the Eastern Front is covered with pins and red lines. The Führer, obsessed, stares fixedly at a point, Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that if the capital fell, the Soviet giant would crumble. Cut off the head, and the body will fall, he told his generals. Thus was born the Operation Typhoon, the final blow that was supposed to end the war in the East before winter arrived. In the fields of East Prussia and Belarus, the roar of engines begins. Thousands of panzer tanks spring to life, belching black smoke. Trucks carry ammunition, rations and men, more than 2 million soldiers. The Wehrmacht troops are ready to advance. Behind them, endless columns of horses, artillery and convoys. The ground trembles under the weight of the largest army the world has ever seen. Marching eastward, the German generals, Guderian, Hübner and von Bock, gazed confidently at the horizon. In their minds, the war was already won. Moscow would fall in weeks. The High Command believed the Red Army was collapsing, without reserves, without morale. Previous victories, Smolensk, Kiev, Minsk, had fueled a sense of almost divine invincibility. The instructions are clear: advance quickly, surround, destroy, and the offensive begins like a storm. The sky is torn by the sound of the Luftwaffe dropping bombs on Soviet positions. Tanks advance in waves, crushing everything in their path. Dust rises, mingling with the smell of oil, gunpowder and blood. With each city taken, the Wehrmacht raises flags bearing the swastika, believing that Moscow will be next. But what the Germans don't know is that the enemy awaiting them ahead is not just the Red Army. It's Russia itself, its vastness, its unforgiving climate, its will to resist until the last man. That October, as the German columns advanced triumphantly toward the capital, the wind grew colder and the sky grayer. One invisible storm, it begins to take shape, not of thunder, but of ice, mud, and death. The road to Moscow will be paved with frozen bodies, broken dreams, and the beginning of the end of Hitler's empire. Operation Typhoon has just begun, and the world is about to witness the moment when German pride will clash with the Russian winter and lose. Subscribe for more untold WW2 battles. The roads of Russia echo with the deafening roar of engines. Endless columns of panzer tanks roll like steel beasts, spewing black smoke, while trucks carry men, ammunition and supplies eastward. Autumn has not yet given way to winter, and the dry, hard ground allows the German war machine to advance at deadly speed. The cool morning sun reflects off the metal of the helmets. Men sing, laughing, confident. Nazi propaganda repeats endlessly, "Moscow will fall before Christmas." They believe. They want to believe. At the head of the columns, the panzer divisions tear through the Soviet defenses with surgical precision. The ground trembles with each cannon shot. Entire villages are reduced to ashes, the air thick with soot and the smell of burnt flesh. The bodies of Soviet soldiers lie scattered along the roads, some still clutching their rifles, frozen with fear. Luftwaffe pilots fly over the columns, roaring like vultures. They bomb trains, bridges, and retreating columns. The sky is dominated. Nothing seems capable of stopping the advance. In a few weeks, cities like Orel and Bryansk fall one after another, swallowed up by the German advance. Inside the tanks, the atmosphere is one of euphoria. The radios crackled with commanding voices. "Forward! Onward to Moscow!" Every meter gained is a promise of glory, a victory foretold. The officers hand out cigarettes and smiles, convinced that they are about to seal the fate of the war. But along the roadsides there is a silent omen. The soldiers notice that the wind is no longer warm. The mornings bring fog, and night falls ever faster. The engines begin to sputter under the approaching cold. Some vehicles break down, minor malfunctions that command ignores. After all, the enemy is still retreating, and the horizon seems open. What the men of the Wehrmacht don't know is that they are moving into a climate trap. Every kilometer gained takes them further away from their supplies. Every tank of fuel burned brings them closer to exhaustion. The road to Moscow for now seems easy, but soon Russian soil itself will exact a price in blood and ice. The Wehrmacht's pride is at its peak, and that's precisely why the fall will be even more brutal. A barriera de Vyazma e Bryansk. The advance seemed unstoppable. The German columns, buoyed by the feeling of victory, marched toward the heart of Russia, until something began to change. Ahead, amidst the waterlogged fields and forests already tinged with cold, the Red Army prepared a final line of defense, Vyazma e Bryansk. These two cities, mere dots on the map, have now become walls of flesh and steel. Zhukov, the new Soviet commander, understands what is at stake. Moscow is right behind them, vulnerable. If these defenses fall, the enemy will see the Kremlin's domes. He cannot allow that, and he orders, "Hold the line, no matter the cost." The shock is brutal. German cannons roar, and the ground trembles with explosions. Soviet forces try to resist, but the Wehrmacht cuts. Their communications divides their units and closes the encirclement with the precision of a guillotine. German planes bomb the retreat routes, turning Soviet columns into living flames. Dear Vyazma, 4 Soviet armies, they are surrounded. The German divisions advance like blades, closing the ring of destruction. Men run in all directions, screaming, lost amidst smoke, fire, and mud. The ground is covered with bodies, thousands of them, charred, mutilated, crushed by tanks. The snow, still thin, begins to fall and mixes with the blood. Bryansk suffers a similar fate. The attack comes from all sides. German machine guns cut through the air with fury, and every tree becomes an improvised tombstone. The Soviets fight to their last cartridge, but the encirclement is complete. More than 600,000 men are captured or killed, one of the greatest military catastrophes in Soviet history. In the German lines, morale is euphoric. Generals shake hands, toast with hot coffee, and send radiant messages. To Berlin, the road to Moscow is open. But there's something they don't realize. The victory came at a cost, precious weeks, and the weather in that Russian autumn is more lethal than any army. While the Germans rejoice, the weather changes subtly and cruelly. The rain falls without stopping, the roads turn to mud, the cold intensifies, and the wind cuts through. What seemed like the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union is, in fact, the beginning of the end of the German advance. In the devastated fields of Vyazma and Bryansk, crows feed on the dead, and the surviving soldiers barely realize that they are about to face an enemy that does not bleed, does not sleep, and does not retreat. The Russian winter, the mud that swallows the army. After their victories in Vyazma and Bryansk, the Germans believe Moscow is within their reach. But then, the Russian sky collapses. For days, a cold, incessant rain falls on the roads of the front. The thick drops turn the ground into a swamp. The soldiers call it the brown hell. The Russians call it Rasputitsa, the mud season. And nobody, not even the most modern army in the world, can fight against it. The panzer tanks, which once roared with confidence, now sink halfway into the roads. Engines groan, smoke billows, and many are trapped forever, transformed into useless piles of iron and grease. Trucks get stuck, horses die of exhaustion trying to pull artillery. Every meter, a desperate effort. Men walk through mud up to their knees, their uniforms soaked, their faces covered in dirt. The cold begins to bite. The trail of destruction left by previous battles has become a deadly trap. Bomb craters, ditches, and bodies now hidden beneath the thick mud. The wheels of the vehicles spin uncontrollably, skidding uncontrollably. The metallic sound of the engines gives way to a cry of human despair. Communications slow down, supplies are delayed, fuel runs out. Starving soldiers open frozen cans with bayonets, trying to snatch out chilled food while barely feeling their fingers. A truck carrying injured people sinks before everyone's eyes, swallowed by the mud. No one can pull it back out. And the worst part is that the sky keeps pouring rain down, as if mocking them. The generals look at their mud-covered maps and realize that the advance has stalled. The road to Moscow, which once seemed straight and glorious, is now a graveyard of machines. Horses die, men push tanks with their bare hands, and the enemy, even from a distance, smells the weakness. While the Germans struggle against the mud, the Russians retreat to new positions, buying time. Zhukov watches from Moscow, calm and calculating. He knows that nature is fighting for him, and soon the cold weather will come. A cold that will spare no one. Operation Typhoon, it begins to lose its breath. German pride sinks along with its tanks, and with it, the first signs of panic begin to appear. The dream of reaching Moscow still lives on, but now, it's covered in tons of mud, blood, and exhaustion. Join us and relive history's bloodiest moments. The sound of the rain ceases. For a brief moment, silence dominates the Russian plains. But this silence does not bring peace. It is the harbinger of frozen death that is approaching. The first frosts fall like an invisible blade. The ground, once slippery mud, suddenly hardens. The puddles turn into mirrors of ice. The wind cuts like a knife, lashing the faces of the German soldiers. They look around, astonished. Winter has arrived, and he arrived too early. Hitler had promised that Moscow would fall before the snow, but now, in the middle of October, the temperature is already plummeting below zero. The Wehrmacht is not prepared. None of them are. The uniforms are thin, made for the European summer. The boots, unlined, crack in the cold. Many soldiers wrap newspapers around their legs to try to protect themselves. Others cover their hands with pieces of torn cloth. It's useless. The cold bites into the flesh, penetrates the bones, and turns men into statues of pain. The engines won't start. The oil in the tanks freezes inside the gears. The rifles jam. The lubricants made for mild climates turn into a solid paste. Soldiers try to light fires with the last drops of fuel, but the wind extinguishes the flames. When the fire finally catches, many fall asleep around it and never wake up again. Found at dawn, frozen in fetal position, eyes wide open, as if still watching over the night. The horses, essential for hauling supplies, begin to die one by one. Those that survive are slaughtered and eaten. The smell of burnt flesh mingles with the frigid air, a cruel reminder of hunger and despair. And yet, the top command insists, "Move forward! Moscow is right around the corner." The men obey, but with each step, they feel their bodies breaking. The wounded die before they can be treated. The ambulances are stopped, frozen in the middle of the roads. Doctors wrap the dead in thin blankets, too weak to bury them. The German ranks, once organized and powerful, now resemble ghosts, stumbling beneath the snow. On the other side, Zhukov watches and waits. He knows the cold is his ally. An invisible soldier, ruthless and loyal to Russia. On freezing nights, snow covers everything: tanks, bodies, weapons, hopes. The German offensive, which began as a roar, turns into a groan of agony, and winter hasn't even really started yet. Zhukov reorganizes the defense in the frozen heart of Moscow, where the autumn of 1941 dissolves into a merciless winter. One man stands like a granite statue amidst the chaos engulfing the Soviet capital. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, born in a poor peasant village in 1896, where snow was as common as stale bread, had risen through the ranks of the Red Army through a life marked by brutal warfare. He fought in World War I as a simple cavalry soldier, surviving the muddy trenches and poison gas that claimed millions. Then, in the Russian Civil War, he commanded Red squadrons against the Whites, learning the lesson of iron discipline on blood-soaked battlefields. In 1939, On the Mongolian steppes at Khalkhin Gol, he crushed Japanese divisions with daring maneuvers, proving that war was not merely brute force, but calculated cunning. Now, at 44, his face marked by invisible scars from the revolution and eyes that seemed like eternal ice wells, Zhukov stares at the map spread out on the table in the Kremlin, tracing lines with steady fingers, while the wind howls outside like a hungry wolf. The entire city pulsates with a primal fear, a terror that seeps into souls like cold into joints. The bells of Orthodox churches, once silenced by the atheist regime, now toll in mournful tones, echoing through the narrow streets where people huddle in panic. Civilians, men from evacuated factories, women with headscarves, wide-eyed children, and elderly people bent by time, are mobilized en masse. They dig trenches along the Moskva River, shovels pounding the frozen earth with a rhythmic sound of despair. Hands bleed, fingernails break, but no one stops. Pickaxes shatter the hardened ground, erecting barriers of earth, wood ripped from abandoned houses, and barbed wire coiled like venomous snakes. Barricades spring up in squares, old tanks are buried up to their turrets as makeshift bunkers, and mines are planted in fields that were once parks. Moscow, the former capital of the Tsars with its golden domes now camouflaged under nets of snow, is transforming into a modern medieval fortress, a labyrinth of death where every street is a trap, every building a firing position. Zhukov, however, sees beyond mere passive resistance. He knows, from past battles like the defense of Leningrad or the bloody retreats of the summer, that survival is not enough. It is necessary to counterattack with surgical precision. With a discipline bordering on the superhuman, he sleeps only 3 hours a night, subsisting on strong tea and dry bread. Zhukov imposes order on chaos. The Soviet troops, decimated by the German blitzkriegs that devoured hundreds of kilometers in weeks, arrive in the capital in tatters. Soldiers with torn uniforms, faces covered in soot, and eyes haunted by visions of panzer tanks roaring over the bodies of comrades. Zhukov regroups scattered armies, merging remnants of the Western Front with fresh reserves. He draws 3 concentric layers of defense, a living wall stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The outer one, a network of outposts and minefields where ski patrols ambush German reconnaissance. The intermediate layer, deep trenches linked by tunnels, reinforced concrete bunkers with Degtyaryov machine guns and 45mm anti-tank guns. The inner layer, around the Kremlin, with heavy artillery and battalions of guards ready for urban combat, street by street, house by house. Every inch of ground is prepared like a slaughterhouse. Anti-tank ditches dug in a zigzag pattern, traps, with grenades attached to wires, forests of barbed wire that tear flesh and uniforms. Reinforcements arrive from the Far East, from the frozen Siberia, where winter is a cruel god that forges men of iron. These soldiers, hardened by years in remote garrisons like Chita or Irkutsk, where temperatures drop to 50 degrees and the wind cuts like blades, march to Moscow in overcrowded trains. Dressed in white bearskin coats or snowy linen camouflage, Mosin Nagant rifles fitted with special lubricants. To prevent freezing, skis on their backs and grenades on their belts, they glide through the snow-covered streets like specters. To the exhausted Muscovites, who see them emerge from the morning mist, they seem like ghosts from the eternal ice. Siberian warriors who know General Winter as a loyal ally, not an enemy. Zhukov immediately integrates them. Divisions like Panfilov's 3rd and 16th, composed of Kazakhs and Russians from the east, positioned at key points such as Volokolamsk, where the undulating terrain favors ambushes. Stalin, the man of steel of Georgia, observes Zhukov with a mixture of reluctant admiration and perpetual paranoia. He had summoned him in October after the disaster at Vyazma Bryansk, where hundreds of thousands were captured, and now gives him carte blanche, a rare thing in a regime where treason is punished with a shot to the back of the head. Zhukov uses this with brutal efficiency, echoing lessons from the Civil War. Political commissars are reinforced. but subordinated to military tactics. Deserters, men who flee the front with frozen feet or broken souls, are shot in public squares, their bodies left as a warning. Cowards. Those who hesitate in charges are hanged from posts in front of the troops, with signs saying "traitors to the fatherland." Order 227, though formalized later, already pulsates in the air, not one step back. Soldiers receive extra rations for bravery, but punishment for failure is immediate. The message penetrates. Moscow will not fall, or everyone dies. On the German side, in the advanced lines, something changes. The attacks that once crushed Soviet divisions in hours now crash against organized walls. Panzer tanks that once roared now face artillery coordinates, infantry counterattacking with fixed bayonets, partisans emerging from the snow to blow up bridges. The bullets don't stop the Red Army. They temper it like steel in a forge. Every soldier knows what's at stake. Moscow is the heart of the Union. Its fall would mean the end of the revolution, the collapse of the homeland. Stories circulate from 1917 of the defense of Petrograd against the Whites, inspiring an almost mystical fervor. The cold intensifies. Snow covers everything in a merciless white blanket, but Zhukov remains standing, implacable, in his underground headquarters. He is in no hurry. He lets the enemy bleed, freeze, weaken in the Rasputitsa that have turned to mud and now to ice. In the shadows, he prepares the counterattack. Siberian reserves positioned to flank, Cossack cavalry ready for night charges, Katyushas hidden in the forests. Hope is reborn in the ruins. Among civilians digging and soldiers training, a roar awakens, that of a people who, as in 1812 against Napoleon, refused to die. Zhukov, the peasant-turned-general, is the catalyst, transforming despair into organized fury. The end of the roads that once pulsed with the triumphant advance of the Wehrmacht, those dusty summer thoroughfares that turned into rivers of mud in autumn, now become endless white tombs in the snow of November 1941. October dissolves into a November that brings temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees, a cold that is not mere weather, but a living, malicious entity that laughs at the invaders with cutting gusts. Each breath of wind carries needles of ice that pierce thin uniforms, designed for European summers, not for the Russian vastness. The Panzer tanks, once masters of the plains with their Maybach engines, roaring at 50 km/h, now lie motionless, frozen blocks of iron where the oil turns to jelly and the tracks merge with the ground. Captured Opel and Ford trucks form an endless trail of metallic ghosts, abandoned for miles with open doors and untouched ammunition loads, for there is no fuel, stocks exhausted in reckless advances. The German High Command, in distant tracks in East Prussia, stubbornly insists, "Moscow is right there. Victory is near." Orders arrive by radio, promising imminent glory. But on the front, the reality is an abyss. There are no more real roads, only trails marked by footprints that fade in the snowstorm, torn and useless maps in a terrain where lakes freeze and forests swallow entire columns. Compasses spin madly in the magnetic field, distorted by the cold. Units get lost, marching in circles for hours, exhausting rations in vain searches. Soldiers, once proud in their divisions like Guderian's 2nd Panzer, collapse in the snow, bodies trembling in convulsions, and never rise again. Frozen in grotesque poses, eyes open to a grey sky. The dead receive no burial. The snow covers them like an impersonal shroud, preserving them in an open-air horror museum. The wind howls between tank carcasses, a lament echoing lost souls. Horses, brought in for logistics in a failing mechanized army, swell under the ice, bellies bursting with gas, a stench mingling with the smell of frozen diesel. German boots, made of thin leather, freeze on the feet when, forcibly removed over makeshift fires, skin and flesh come off together, leaving bloody stumps wrapped in rags. Every step is an ordeal. legs swollen with frostbite, joints creaking like rusty metal. Breaths escape in white clouds, freezing mustaches and eyelashes, burning lungs with air that feels like liquid fire. The Luftwaffe, terror of the skies with its Messerschmitts and Stukas that bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam, barely takes off now. Planes covered in layers of ice require bonfires under their wings to thaw aviation fuel, but winds thwart attempts, and pilots with numb fingers barely control the control stick. On the soldiers' faces, the euphoria of June, when Paris fell and Kiev was besieged, evaporates like dew. Sunken eyes, cheeks hollowed by hunger, some weep silently under their helmets, tears freezing in salty trails. Others delirious, talking to ghosts of home, fevers of galloping pneumonia claiming more than bullets. Rationing is ruthless. One piece of hard, moldy, frozen bread a day. When that runs out, leather belts are chewed, boots boiled in pots over low fires. Water comes from melted snow, bitter and contaminated. In the midst of this inferno, Soviet cannons echo again. Zhukov's 76mm guns, positioned high up, firing salvos that shatter stray columns. Defenses hold. Attempts to break through Mozhaisk or Naro-Fominsk end in carnage. German bodies piled up like firewood. Heinz Guderian, the armored vehicle genius who conceived the Blitzkrieg in 1939, notes in his hidden diary with a trembling hand, "The road to Moscow is over. Our men are exhausted, vehicles paralyzed. The cold is the true master of war now, and it fights for the Russians." He is right. The advance, once an avalanche of steel that devoured Poland in days and France in weeks, becomes a procession of the living dead. Moscow, less than 100 kilometers away, appears on the horizon on clear days, domes gleaming in the weak sun, but unreachable, separated by an invisible barrier. Russia itself, with its ancestral winter that swallowed legions of Charles the Feicend in 1708 and Napoleon in 1812. Hitler's dream, the Führer who promised Lebensraum and victory before Christmas, rots under the snow. Glory turns into raw survival. Soldiers steal from dead comrades. Officers consider retreat heretical. Among the invaders, the myth of invincibility cracks like ice under boots, and what was conquest is now just a long, agonizing retreat to sanity. The people of Moscow prepare for the end. October 1941 dissolves into November like a deepening nightmare, and Moscow, the city of 1,000 golden domes of czars and commissars of the bloody revolutions of 1905 and 1917, now pulsates with the distant sound of German cannons, a low thunder that makes the ground tremble like the heart of a wounded animal. Each explosion echoes through the wide avenues, vibrating in the already cracked windows of old buildings, in the red brick walls that once housed imperial balls and now serve as shelter for huddled families. The snow falls in thick, silent flakes, covering the streets with a white blanket that masks the chaos. Abandoned carts, torn suitcases, official papers scattered like dead leaves. But the air is charged with electrical tension, an invisible hum that makes hair stand on end and stomachs clench. The enemy is near, less than 100 kilometers away, say the rumors that spread like icy wind through the breadlines. The black markets in the alleys, the communal kitchens, where women exchange whispers about husbands at the front. News arrives in fragments, leaflets dropped from Soviet planes, radios crackling in the dark, the mouths of NKVD informants. The fascists have taken Mozhaisk. Panzers sighted in Kubinka. Panic erupts like a wave. Thousands rush to train stations, pushing wheelbarrows laden with mattresses, pots and icons stolen from closed churches. Mothers pull children by their frozen hands. The elderly drag trunks with yellowed photos of a pre-revolutionary Russia. But there is no escape. The roads to the east are destroyed by bombs, bridges blown up to delay the German advance, overcrowded trains evacuate entire factories, dismantled machines and workers to the distant Urals. Winter transforms the world into an endless white desert, where wolves howl at night and partisans ambush columns. Many return, exhausted, frozen. accepting their fate in the besieged city. Stalin, the Georgian with the thick mustache and steely eyes, who had survived purges and Siberian exiles, refuses to flee. While generals whisper about evacuation to Kuibyshev, he remains in the Kremlin, working on maps until dawn, smoking his pipe in rooms crammed with terrified advisors. On November 7th, the anniversary of the revolution that overthrew the Tsar and forged the Soviet Union in blood and fire, a daring parade takes place in Red Square. Heavy snow falls. The thermometer reads 15 degrees, but T-34 tanks fresh from the factories roar over the uneven cobblestones. Soldiers in white overcoats march in perfect formation, bayonets gleaming. They pass Lenin's mausoleum, the embalmed body of the revolutionary leader still inside like a talisman, and head straight for the Western Front. Civilians crowded the sides applaud with gloved hands, tears freezing on their faces. The gesture is symbolic, almost suicidal. German planes could bomb the square, but powerful. Moscow lives, breathes, fights. Stalin speaks from the top of the mausoleum, his deep voice echoing through the loudspeakers. The motherland calls us, victory or death. It is an echo of 1812, when Kutuzov defended the city against Napoleon, burning it to deny victory to the enemy. On the streets, the line between civilian and soldier dissolves. Women, factory workers, teachers, housewives wear makeshift uniforms sewn from old work clothes, holding Mosin-Nagant rifles they barely know how to handle, trained in public squares by Civil War veterans. Teenagers of 14, 15, their eyes, gleaming with a mixture of fear and excitement, carry boxes of F1 grenades, learning to pull pins in nighttime drills. Younger children distribute hot tea from rusty buckets, wrap bandages from torn sheets, and run messages between posts. Each neighborhood organizes militias. The Zamoskvorechi district forms battalions of dock workers. In Taganka, intellectuals and artists dig trenches singing partisan hymns from 1918. Funeral signals sound from Orthodox towers, sirens wail bombing alerts, and the icy air cuts faces like razors, but nobody stops. Zarodinu, for the fatherland, becomes the cry that unites everyone. Factories pulsate day and night, an industrial roar that drowns out fear. In plants like the tank factory in Kodinka or the munitions factory in Tushino, machines never stop. T-34 tanks roll off the assembly lines with fresh, still wet paint, straight to the front, driven by workers who have become drivers. 16-hour shifts, floors covered in slippery grease, blood from cuts on sharp metal, ice forming on open windows, deliberately, so that the heat of the furnaces doesn't lull the exhausted to sleep. "We work with the windows wide open," says a worker with sunken eyes, calloused hands wrapped in rags. "So the cold keeps us awake, to remind us of our comrades out there, freezing for us." Women weld armor, men forge pipes, teenagers carry projectiles, families separated, husbands at the front, wives on the lines, children in makeshift nurseries. The city becomes an army. Squares like Pushkin are dug up for anti-tank mines, parks like Gorky transformed into shooting ranges with wooden targets painted with swastikas. Hospitals spring up in schools, desks stacked for beds, teachers becoming nurses. In churches, icons covered for surgeries. In damp metro basements, stations like Mayakovskaya house thousands, beds on platforms, operations by lantern light. Floodlights in the Kremlin sweep the night sky, even under Luftwaffe bombardment. Incidental. Bombs fall, setting wooden roofs ablaze, but the lights remain. Vigilant eyes defying the darkness. Explosions are approaching. The ground trembles as in earthquakes, windows shatter in showers of crystal, dust falls from the ceilings. Underground shelters are overflowing, families sing old Civil War songs, Katyusha echoing off the damp walls, mothers clutch their children to their racing chests, old men tell stories from 1812 to calm the terror. Fear is there, yes, cold sweat despite the ice, whispered prayers to forgotten gods. But a silent force emerges, Russian stubbornness forged in centuries of invasions, from Mongols to Poles. Moscow breathes in unison, a collective inspiration of determination. The city awaits the final impact, vowing in snow and fire. If it falls, it will fall fighting, street by street, brick by brick, until its last breath. The impossible siege. At the gates of Moscow, December 1941 descends like a divine hammer upon the plains west of Moscow. The cold, not merely winter, but ancestral punishment. Thermometers plummeting to 40 degrees, air cutting lungs like glass blades, turning breaths into clouds that freeze instantly. Hitler's army, once an invincible avalanche that had swallowed Poland in 27 days, France in 42, the Balkans in weeks, now crawls in the snow like a wounded worm, hungry, exhausted, dying by the thousands. Thin leather boots tear, feet swell with festering frostbite blisters, rotting into black gangrene. Soldiers cut frozen boots, with knives screaming when flesh comes along. Lubricants in tanks turn to solid glue. Maybach engines refuse to turn. Mauser rifles jam with ice in their mechanisms. Horses, the last remnants of the logistics, collapse from hunger. Bodies cut into raw pieces devoured around weak fires, blood freezing before it touches the ground. The wind howls among the ruins of burned villages, tearing away hope like dry leaves, carrying the groans of abandoned wounded. Still, blinded by the Führer's propaganda, which promised Moscow captured before winter, Lebensraum for the 1,000-year Reich, they advance. Binoculars tremble in numb hands, revealing Kremlin domes a few kilometers away, shining like mirages on the white horizon. But every step is hell. Snow up to their knees, then wastes, columns lost in blizzards where visibility is zero. Officers shout orders in vain, maps useless in shifting terrain. Soviets, on the other hand, were born in this ice. Zhukov's troops, reorganized since October, arrive in relentless waves. Siberian divisions of the 1st Shock Army, men from Yakutsk or Vladivostok, where 50 degrees Celsius is routine, dressed in white overcoats, invisible in the snow, skis on their feet, rifles lubricated with special oils. They hunt silently, ambush German patrols in frozen birch forests, attack like ghosts of the night with blood-curdling cries of "Hurrah!" German lines crumble like sandcastles. What was a triumphant advance turns into a nightmare. Russians emerge from camouflaged bunkers. PPSH machine guns fire 900 rounds per minute, bayonets fixed in wild charges. The sound of gunfire mixes with the crack of ice under boots, grenades exploding in showers of shrapnel. Spilled blood freezes in bright red pools under the pale moonlight, bodies piled up like firewood. German officers attempt to restore order. Radios fail due to frozen batteries, fuel runs out for retreats, ammunition dwindles in empty pouches. Men lose fingers blackened by necrosis, amputated with axes in makeshift camps. Some, driven mad by pain, shoot themselves in the chest for a merciful escape. Others lie in the snow, close their eyes, too exhausted for suicide, becoming white statues. Moscow resists, a beacon in the chaos. Defenses are strengthened with new layers of mines, barbed wire, artillery. Factories roar, Katyusha rockets mounted on trucks, projectiles cast. A hardened people watch with fear and pride. Loudspeakers in the streets announce victories. Klin, liberated, enemy repelled in Istra. Sparks of hope in frozen hearts. Hitler at Wolfschanze in Prussia rejects reality, demands fight to the last man, dismisses generals like Höppner for cowardly retreats. But nature decrees, the Wehrmacht rots, divisions reduced to skeletons. The dream of the Orient dies on the plains that swallowed Charles XIV at Poltava, Napoleon at Borodino. Nazi eagles freeze in torn uniforms, broken on the ground. A frigid wind carries away the echo of defiant ambition, destroyed by the impossible. Zhukov's counterattack, the roar of winter, December 5th, 1941. The previous night had been the coldest ever recorded on the makeshift thermometers of the front, 42 degrees in Klin, 38 degrees in Istra, 45 degrees in the forests north of Volokholamsk. The air is so dry it crackles like glass. Each breath burns the throat. Each exhale forms a cloud that freezes and falls like diamond dust. The sun, a pale, heatless disk, sinks behind a curtain of fine, sharp snow, and with it vanishes the last vestige of German hope. In the Soviet trenches, pits dug with pickaxes in the crust of ice, covered by roofs of logs and snow. The men wait in absolute silence. There are no fires. The heat would attract enemy artillery. Only the bluish glow of kerosene lanterns, the gnashing of teeth, the metallic click of bolts being lubricated with winter oil. At 5:47 a.m., the silence is broken. 1,700 cannons, howitzers, and Katyusha rockets, hidden in ravines, pine, forests, and behind camouflaged hills, open fire simultaneously. The sound is not thunder, it is the planet itself splitting apart. The ground leaps half a meter, snow explodes in white columns 20 meters high, and the shockwave knocks down German soldiers 3 kilometers away. In Klin, an observer from the 7th Panzer Division later describes, "The entire horizon turned into a volcano. The snow rose and never came down again. It hung suspended in the air like smoke." Zhukov is at the forward command post in Dedovsk, a half-burned village 25 kilometers from the Kremlin. He wears a Siberian wolfskin coat, his face illuminated only by the green light of the tactical map. His eyes, cold, calculating, do not blink. He doesn't shout. He speaks softly into the radio. "North front, advance. South front, advance. Center, press to the bone. Push them back to the hell they came from." The order is transmitted in code, repeated in whispers by 17-year-old telephone operators, and written down in notebooks soaked with melted snow. The Siberian machine awakens. The reinforcements have been arriving for weeks, but only now are they being deployed. They are 28 fresh divisions, approximately 550,000 men, transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack. They come from Rokossovsky's 16th Army, Kuznetsov's 1st Shock Army, and Vlasov's 20th Army. These are troops who trained in temperatures of 55 degrees on the banks of the Amur, who hunt bears with knives, who sleep in holes in the snow without feeling it. They wear telogrease-padded felt valenki, cowrie shells, down to their knees, white camouflage coats sewn by women from Khabarovsk. They carry birch skis, dog sleds, PPD machine guns in wooden boxes greased with fish oil. Their Mosin rifles have whale lubricant. They fire at 40 degrees without jamming. They don't march, they glide. Ski patrols from the 44th Kiev Division cross German lines at night, cut telephone cables, and blow up depots containing toll cargo. In a single night, 42 wooden bridges are reduced to ashes. The triple heist Northern Front, Kalinin. At 06:15, Yushkevich's 31st Army attacks with the 1st Ski Division. Men in white emerge from the forest like ghosts, skis squeaking on the crust of ice. They advance 800 meters in 12 minutes, flank the 6th Panzer Division, capture 38 intact tanks. The Germans inside frozen in their seats, hands still on the steering wheels. Centro, Klin, Solnekhnogorsk. Here the terrain is open, perfect for armored vehicles. Zhukov launches 120 T-34s from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, commanded by Katukov. The tanks, painted white, engines heated with kerosene lamps, advance at 35 km/h across the ice. Behind them, motorized infantry in American Studebaker trucks, early Lend-Lease trucks, unleash waves of men. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, the Empire, it is caught in the act. Within 2 hours, 42 Panzer III tanks lie burning, their crews shot as they attempt to flee on foot. Southern Front, Tula Kaluga. Here the terrain is frozen swamp cut by ravines. Boldin's 50th Army uses Cossack cavalry, 4,000 Siberian horses, short and sturdy, for flanking. The Cossacks charge with sabers and PPSH rifles, shouting "Za Stalina!" At Kashira, they surround the 17th Panzer Division. In 48 hours, they capture 3,000 prisoners, most with gangrenous feet. The German retreat, a procession of corpses. The Germans don't retreat. They crumble. Hitler's order is to keep every meter, but the meter is already a tomb. December 6th, the 7th, Panzer Division abandons Klin after losing 70% of its vehicles. Soldiers march on foot, carrying wounded men in doors torn from houses. A lieutenant notes, the Russians aren't shooting anymore. They're letting the cold do the work. December 7th. In Istra, the 10th Panzer Division attempts a counterattack with 18 tanks. 15 are destroyed by T-34s ambushed in a pine forest. The remaining 3 explode due to lack of fuel. Crews set them on fire to avoid capture. December 8th. The temperature drops to 48 degrees. In a single column of the 258th Infantry Division, 200 men freeze overnight. They wake up standing, leaning against trees, eyes open. Bodies mark the path. A soldier with his head blown apart by shrapnel, still holding a family photo. An officer with his pistol in his mouth, his finger frozen on the trigger. A gutted horse, entrails steaming in the frigid air. Helmet, steel helmet. They roll like dirty snowballs. Kar 98K rifles lie. Broken, stocks cracked by the cold. Opel Blitz trucks form makeshift barricades, burned to warm their last moments of life. Zhukov, the relentless hammer. Zhukov does not allow pauses. His headquarters moves forward every 48 hours. Dedovsk, Krasnogorsk, Khimki. He sleeps 2 hours a night on a camp cot, always wearing his boots. He eats black bread and drinks tea with Georgian brandy. Dictation to his aides. Every hour of rest they have is an hour of breathing for us. Press until their hearts stop. He personally adjusts the Katyusha fire via radio, 200 meters further to the left. Now, in a liberated village, he finds a 12-year-old boy frozen, holding a grenade. He orders him to be buried with military honors. Moscow wakes up. In the capital at 9 a.m. on the 6th, the loudspeakers crackle, "Citizens of Moscow, the enemy is retreating on all fronts. Klin liberated, Solnekhnogorsk ours again." People emerge from their shelters. An old woman in a black shawl kisses the snow-covered ground. Female workers from tank factory number 183 dance in the grease, their hands still clutching screwdrivers. Children run with red flags sewn from bedsheets. In the Kremlin, Stalin appears on the balcony, a rare occurrence, and raises his fist. The crowd roars until they lose their voices. The symbol. On December 9th, the 78th Siberian Division entered Klin. A 23-year-old sergeant, Ivan Petrov, climbed onto what remained of the German town hall and planted a red flag on the burnt. A roof, the photo taken by a war correspondent with a frozen Leica, would go around the world, the flag fluttering against a leaden sky, snow falling like ashes. WW2 Typhoon. On December 20th, the German line is 250 kilometers west of where it was on December 5th. 130,000 Soviet prisoners liberated from makeshift camps. 1,200 German tanks destroyed or captured. 400 Luftwaffe planes lost on frozen runways. Hitler dismisses von Bock and appoints Kluge, but the damage is done. The Wehrmacht will never advance that far again. The roar of winter is not a metaphor. It's the sound of 1,700 cannons at 5:47 a.m. It's the squeal of skis in the snow at 3 a.m. It's the cracking of bones freezing at 4 a.m. It's the cry of hurrah echoing 300 kilometers ahead. It is the silence that comes after, when the last German soldier closes his eyes in the snow, and the wind carries away the echo of a blitzkrieg that believed it could conquer Russia before Christmas. Zhukov looks at the map. By candlelight, he marks the new line with a red pencil. So for the first time in months, you allow yourself a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. The march to Berlin has begun. The Wehrmacht's retreat. The cursed withdrawal. December 1941. The German front is collapsing. The pride of the Wehrmacht, that army that swept across Europe like thunder, now staggers, blind and broken, under the weight of the Russian winter. The dream of taking Moscow has turned into a march of the undead. The instructions are clear: retreat. But what should have been a tactical move turns into a desperate escape. Frozen roads are clogged with abandoned trucks, immobilized tanks, and snow-covered bodies. Men stagger along, dragging their feet, with pale faces and empty eyes, the expression of someone who no longer expects to live. Soviet troops pursue relentlessly. T-34 tanks hunt down the retreating columns, crushing vehicles and destroying positions. Artillery fires relentlessly, raining steel down on the roads. The weakened Luftwaffe can barely fly, and the skies now belong to the Red Army. The cold is the true executioner. Temperatures of 40 degrees, they freeze everything: fuel, metal, and human flesh. The guns jam, the radios fail, the engines die. German soldiers, lacking proper clothing, wrap themselves in blankets, pieces of canvas, and rags torn from corpses. Those who fall rarely get back up. The snow covers them in silence. The officers try to maintain discipline, but order gives way to despair. Units lose track of each other. Maps cease to make sense. In the darkness, there are only the sounds of moans and hooves breaking the ice. Hungry horses devour their own harnesses. Men tear off chunks of frozen meat to survive. Others, too wounded to continue, beg to be left behind. With each abandoned village, the Red Army advances. The Russians are everywhere, in the forests, in the hills, behind the ruins. Ambushes, snipers, explosions in the middle of the night. For the Germans, hell has gained a new name: the road back. Many try to take shelter in destroyed houses, but the cold seeps right down to their bones. There are reports of soldiers frozen while standing, still holding their rifles. Men who died in their sleep and were only discovered days later, covered in frost, like ice statues. On the radios, a desperate voice echoes: "The line is broken. We're being surrounded. There are no reinforcements. There's no fuel." Hitler, far away in his headquarters, prohibits complete withdrawal. He orders his generals to fight to the last man, calling any attempt to retreat cowardice. But on the Russian steppes, the reality is different. His army is being destroyed. Operation Typhoon ended in ruin. The Germans left more than 500,000 dead, wounded, and missing. And the road to Moscow, once filled with tanks and Nazi flags, is now covered with bodies and wooden crosses, half buried in the ice. The pride of the Wehrmacht lay frozen on those plains. And the whole world realized that Hitler's empire was not invincible. The Blitzkrieg had met its first major grave, the Russian winter, the devouring winter, nature against man, January 1942. The Eastern Front is no longer a war. It's a struggle for survival against the earth itself. The temperature plummets to unimaginable levels, 45 degrees C. The wind cuts across the face like blades. The snow covers everything: bodies, weapons, vehicles, like a white cloak of death. The Germans had never faced anything like this before. They came to conquer, not to survive. They brought no adequate warm clothing, no fuel to heat the tanks, nor enough food to feed millions of men. What was once an organized force is now a mass of soldiers with sunken eyes and fingers blackened by gangrene. The rifles freeze the instant they touch the air. Lubricants turn to stone. Engines crack, tires burst, and steel shatters like glass. Men spit blood, their lungs burn from breathing so much icy air. Every breath is a battle. Inside the trenches, the scene is horrific. Stacked bodies serve as a barrier against the wind. Many people fall asleep and never wake up. Others, delirious with fever, tear off their own gloves, exposing their hands to the deadly cold. And there are those who, in desperation, try to warm themselves with pieces of burning clothing, dying, burned in the middle of the snow. The Red Army is also suffering, but it is prepared. The Russians have lined boots, thick coats, and knowledge of the terrain. They move across the ice as part of the landscape. They know where to take shelter, where to hunt, and how to resist. For them, winter is just another enemy, an enemy they learned to tame. For the Germans, however, It's a never-ending nightmare. Hitler's orders keep coming, senseless. No retreat, no surrender. But the troops no longer have the strength to obey. The generals send increasingly desperate reports detailing mass freezes, desertions, and suicides. The supply lines are dead. Only silence reigns in the communications, a silence broken only by the howling of the wind and the cracking of frozen bones. Nature becomes the cruelest executioner of war. No bullet is needed to kill. The cold is enough. Winter devours man, steel, fire, and even faith. Bodies hardened by frost lie upright on the roads, faces covered in ice crystals, eyes open and empty. They seem to gaze at the horizon, waiting for a sunrise that never comes. For the Russians, that winter was not just a season. It was the revenge of Mother Russia herself, an ancient, merciless and impartial force that punished every foreign step on its soil. Napoleon had learned this in 1812, and now Hitler would learn as well. The devouring winter spared no one, and when it finally dissipated, what remained was a landscape of total destruction, a frozen graveyard of tanks and men. There, amidst the ice and blood, the true beginning of the end for Nazi Germany was born. Broken pride. Hitler and the shock of defeat. Berlin, January 1942. As the Eastern Front transforms into a graveyard of iron and ice, Hitler lives in denial. In the stuffy corridors of his headquarters, the Führer shouts, pounds tables, and tears up maps with his bare hands. The man who believed himself invincible now faces the impossible, the defeat against Moscow. He had promised the German people that the Soviet Union would fall before winter. He had promised that communism would be crushed, that flags bearing the swastika would fly over the Kremlin. But instead, he receives reports of chaos, deaths, and evacuations. The generals, Guderian, Bock, Hupner, arrive exhausted, covered in shame and fear. They try to explain the cold, the lack of supplies, Soviet power, the mistake of underestimating the enemy. But Hitler doesn't want to listen. For him, it's never his fault. You didn't believe in victory enough. He shouts, he says, his voice echoing through the icy halls of the barracks. If they had the courage, Moscow would already be ours. He calls his own marshals cowards, threatens to dismiss them, and accuses them of treason. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers are freezing to death thousands of kilometers away, obeying orders that no longer make sense. On the outskirts of Moscow, the remaining officers try to maintain their honor, but the reality is brutal. The armies are shattered. Men with amputated feet, without ammunition, without food, without hope. Some write letters, home, asking for forgiveness. Others simply disappear into the endless white of Russia. Hitler, blinded by rage, he rejects any strategic retreat. He orders that every position be held at all costs. Small towns and villages are transformed into useless fortresses. Thousands die just defending ruins. No reason. Behind the scenes, some generals are already whispering the Führer is out of touch with reality. He is leading us to ruin, but no one dares to confront him. The fear is absolute. And Hitler's pride, that morbid pride that makes him believe that willpower can conquer nature, it sealed the fate of the Wehrmacht. As the Red Army regains strength and winter begins to subside, the world realizes what has happened. Blitzkrieg, the invincible lightning, it was extinguished by ice and blood. The absolute German victory, so certain months before, it crumbled under the weight of arrogance, and the Führer, isolated and furious, begins to distrust everyone, the generals, the allies, even reality itself. The defeat in Moscow is more than just a military failure, and the beginning of Hitler's psychological downfall. For the first time, he feels fear, and this fear will haunt him until the end of the war, fueling his insane decisions, his paranoia, and his thirst for revenge. Pride was shattered, and with it, the illusion that the Third Reich would never be defeated. The echoes of defeat. Moscow rises from the ashes. Moscow, early 1942. The city that everyone said was lost It's still standing. Its streets are covered in snow, its walls burned and marked by bullet holes, but the heart of the Soviet capital beats stronger than ever. Moscow resisted. The church bells are ringing again. People emerge from underground shelters and makeshift bunkers. Women, children, old people, everyone looks up at the sky and realizes the German bombers are gone. The threat that hung over the city dissipated, swallowed up by the very winter that Hitler so despised. Victory did not come easily. In each street recaptured, there are frozen bodies, Germans and Soviets, lying side by side. Houses reduced to ruins, tanks burned, hungry dogs scavenging through debris. But amidst the ice and destruction, there's a new feeling in the air: hope. The loudspeakers echo the news that changes the course of the war. The enemy has been repelled. Moscow is saved. Men cry, women hug each other, children wave red flags made from pieces of fabric. The entire city lights up, even in the biting cold. The Soviet people, who just a few months ago were digging trenches at the gates of the capital, are now celebrating the impossible. Marshal Zhukov is received as a hero. His name is whispered with respect, almost like that of a holy warrior. He proved that the German army could bleed, and that the Soviet giant would not only resist, but I would retaliate. In the factories, the sound of hammers and furnaces is rekindled. The workers return to work day and night, producing tanks, weapons and ammunition. Soviet industry, driven by pure patriotism, is reborn beneath the snow. Each bullet forged is a promise of revenge. Meanwhile, on the front, the Red Army begins to regain ground. Occupied towns and cities return to Soviet control, and in each liberated place, the soldiers find the horror left by the Germans: burned houses, decimated families, bodies scattered on the roads. Revenge will not just be a word, it will be a mission. Stalin, now triumphant, appears in public for the first time since the start of the invasion. He speaks to the people via radio. The Germans wanted Moscow. They wanted to enslave our land, to erase our history. But Moscow resisted. Moscow won. His words resonated throughout the Soviet Union. From Leningrad to Stalingrad, from Murmansk to the Caucasus, the spirit of resistance is ignited. The victory in Moscow is not just military, it's symbolic. She proves that Hitler's army can be stopped, that the monster can bleed, that the tide of war can turn. And it changed. That winter, in the snow-covered ruins, the beginning of the counteroffensive was born, the counteroffensive that would one day lead the Red Army to Berlin. The Soviet people, hardened by pain and hunger, vow never to retreat again. Hell has passed, but the war is far from over. The roar from Moscow spreads throughout the world, and the Third Reich, for the first time, trem, the legacy of the storm, when winter changed the fate of the world. The Eastern Front falls. Silent for a moment. The weapons fall silent, but the wind continues to blow. Cold, cruel, eternal. In the vast white expanse of Russia lie the ruins of the largest offensive ever launched by Nazi Germany. Operation Typhoon, the grandiose plan to conquer Moscow and destroy the Soviet Union, has ended, buried under the snow. More than 500,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Thousands of tanks and trucks lost. Miles of roads covered in bodies and twisted metal. The army that believed it would dominate the world was stopped not only by men, but by an invisible enemy, the Russian winter. The scars of defeat are deep. The Wehrmacht would never regain the power and momentum it had in 1941. The lightning war, the blitzkrieg, froze to death before the gates of Moscow. And with her, the myth of German invincibility is dead. For Germany, that defeat was the beginning of the end. But for the Soviet people, it was the beginning of a legend. The victory in Moscow would become an eternal symbol of the resistance, courage, and fury of a people who refused to kneel. Men and women who fought to their last breath, facing tanks, hunger, and ice. And they won. Hitler would never forgive that humiliation. Blinded by rage, he would turn his eyes southward to the steppes of Stalingrad. But what he didn't know yet was that the defeat at Moscow had sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The Nazi Empire was beginning to crumble, and the clock of war was ticking against it. Meanwhile, Moscow, destroyed and cold, is rising again. Citizens clean the streets, bury their dead, and return to work in the factories and fields. They know the worst is yet to come, but now they believe. Because they proved to the world that strength lies not only in tanks nor in weapons, but in the will to resist. The storm of steel and ice, Operation Typhoon, was not just a battle. He was a turning point in the history of humanity. There, on the snow-covered plains, the fate of the world changed forever. The German advance was halted. The Red Army survived, and Hitler's dream to conquer the East and dominate the world, he froze to death in front of Moscow. The Russian winter, relentless and silent, became the ultimate judge of the war, and the sound of the wind that blew across the battlefields carried with it a warning that echoes to this day. No empire is strong enough to defeat the fury of the earth that refuses to die. From that point on, the war would enter a new phase. Bloodier, more brutal, more decisive. But the world would never forget what happened in the winter of 1941. That was the moment when history changed direction, when the snow triumphed over the steel. Winter has arrived mercilessly. The wind roared like 1,000 blades, cutting through flesh, uniform, and soul. The road to Moscow, which months before had seemed like a path to glory, was now just a death corridor, covered in snow, bodies, and frozen steel. The tanks that once roared proudly now lay motionless, transformed into blocks of frozen iron. The engines no longer started. The fuel had turned into a liquid as thick as coagulated blood. The horses fell one by one, and the men who had crossed Europe believing in victory, now crawled in the snow, hungry with empty eyes, clutching their rifles only to keep their hands from freezing. Operation Typhoon ended there at the gates of Moscow, not with a glorious explosion, but with the deadly silence of a disintegrating army. The Wehrmacht's pride had been shattered not only by Soviet bullets, but by the invisible enemy Hitler had ignored, the cold. The same cold that brought Napoleon to a standstill now brought Germany to a standstill. Berlin's orders no longer made sense. Communication lines were cut, officers burned maps to keep warm, soldiers ripped the boots off the dead in an attempt to survive another day. Every step was torture, every breath agony. In the vast white expanse, the most common sound was that of bones breaking under the ice. And while the Germans died in silence, the hardened and silent Soviets advanced. They had no pity. They had memories of burned villages, destroyed families, dead friends. Now, vengeance came with the north wind. The Soviet capital had resisted. Moscow would not fall. And in the frozen ruins surrounding the city, the Red Army planted its flags over enemy bodies, as if nailing a promise to the ground. Never again will an invader set foot on this land with impunity. Hitler had believed that the war in the East would end in weeks. But there, on the frozen plains of Russia, he discovered the fatal mistake that would change the course of World War II. The defeat in Moscow was the first sign of the collapse of the Third Reich, the beginning of a fall that would end in ruin, fire, and suicide 4 years later in Berlin. The dream of conquering the East froze to death that winter, and the ghosts of Operation Typhoon still haunt the Russian snow. Soldiers who never returned home, whose names have been lost to time. The road to Moscow continues on, silent, but beneath the ice the echoes of an eternal lesson sleep. Not every army can conquer nature. Not every man can conquer his own pride. On the road to Moscow, winter didn't choose sides, it just killed.